as I said before, we're just now going to transition as smoothly as we can to the next part of today's event, which is a conversation between Daan Frenkel, University of Cambridge, and I will not reveal if he is or is not the other Boltzmann Medal winner in the audience, but you can probably guess, and Marianne Mansigh. You've heard a little bit, some hints about her work in the previous talk. Michelle, thank you for setting the stage so nicely for what's coming up next. I'm really not going to tell you much about her because you will get to know her, I am sure, through the answers that she's going to give to Daan's questions.
Good afternoon. I'm here really to let Marianne speak, and so I will say as little as possible. I'll try to suppress mansplaining and myself. I want to say just a few words. First of all, when I was an undergraduate student, Bernie Older gave a series of lectures in Amsterdam, and this is how I first heard about his work, and I started reading the papers, and then I came across Marianne's name. I never met Marianne until Bernie Older's 90th birthday, which was celebrated 2 years ago in Livermore, and there was the first moment I actually saw the person about whom I read so much, and I briefly chatted to her, and it was more or less through that brief chat that we were able to organize this event, and I'm really thrilled that this is happening. The second thing I wanted to say is that Marianne played an absolutely crucial role in developing the codes for molecular and dynamic simulations that, as you saw from Michel's statistics, are now incredibly important in so many different fields. However, Michel also mentioned the Metropolis Monte Carlo method that was not invented by Metropolis, where there were 2 women involved. Michel mentioned the Fermi-Pasta-Ulam earlier simulations of nonlinear dynamics that actually were the Fermi-Pasta-Ulam-Tsingu simulations, because again there was a woman involved. And the Kirkwood transition, so the prediction that Kirkwood made in the 1940s about the fact that hard spheres could freeze, was actually the Monroe-Kirkwood prediction, because Monroe, who actually had been a PhD student at Cambridge, did the work together with John Kirkwood. So I just want to stress the fact that when we talk about women who have not received enough credit for their role in the development of the field, Marianne Mansigh is a prime example, but she is not the only one. Okay, so that's my only introduction, and what I would like to do now is to ask a few questions, and then I would say let Marianne speak, and at some point, maybe also because of time, I will even try to have to stop her, but I will not be popular because of that. What can I do? Marianne, first of all, absolutely wonderful that you can be here. And let me start with a question about yourself, because you grew up in rural Minnesota, and I can imagine that the step from rural Minnesota to actually getting a university education at all may not have been completely obvious at the time.
So I don't think this is turned on, is it?
Oh, should I?
Okay.
Did you hear
Very
what
good.
I said, though?
Yes, I did.
Okay, good.
I heard that. Well, I grew up in a small town in Minnesota when we graduated from high school, women only had about 3 options that if they wanted to go on to college. One was to be a teacher, one was to be a nurse, and the other one was to go to business school and work in offices. And the most popular choice was a 2-year course to teach elementary school, but I didn't want to do that. And I fortunately got a scholarship to go to the University of Minnesota for 1 year, which was given to the highest girl and the highest boy ranked in grades in high school, which really gave an opportunity to a lot of people who ordinarily wouldn't go to school. So I chose to go to the Duluth branch of the University of Minnesota. 3 of my classmates chose to go through the two-year course to teach high school, my girlfriends, and I knew of 2 boys who went on to school. So it was not even though it was unusual for girls to go to college, it was also rather unusual for men to go to college at the same time. It was right after World War II, and many of them went into the service, but a few people just went on to school, and they were exempt from going into the service by choosing college. I had the one-year scholarship so that it was easy for me to at least start my education, and then I worked the rest of the time while I was going to school to support myself. So it worked out very well. I was going to be a math and science teacher, but I found once I went into college, math was really my big love, and I spent most of my time taking every math course they offered me while I was in college. When I graduated, it was quite hard to just think of going to be a teacher, so I decided to come to California. My sister was living here, and that's what brought me into to look for work, and that's what got me my job. I guess I wasn't eager to be a school teacher.
I mean, maybe it is interesting to point out that although you played a key role in developing codes for electronic computers, when you grew up, there was no electronic computing, and as I understand, it's not even electricity.
That was true. When I was in college, nobody mentioned computers. Nobody mentioned programming, certainly not. In fact, the only class I took that was related at all to computation was numerical analysis. And the teacher told us, I hope you never have to use this, because all it means is punching desk calculator and spending hours and hours just sitting there with the desk calculator. And they had no idea that it'd be very important once we came into the computer field, and it was the most important one at that time.
I think that the slide shows a very important advertisement here. It says, "Man wanted," and it is actually an advertisement that was posted by Lawrence Livermore, the National Laboratory, for recent graduates needed for a 3-month training in Operation Digital Computing Machine. You wisely ignored the fact that it says men wanted, and you applied. Maybe you can tell a bit more what happened next.
I ignored the men wanted completely. I saw mathematics, and that's all it took. I was going to go there. Actually, we had no idea where Livermore was. You had to look in the map to find it. It was about 50 miles. I didn't have a car. I didn't drive. I was living with a roommate who was a student at UC Berkeley, and she had a car and told me she'd take me there after she was through with classes on Friday afternoon. So we drove out to this little town far away on country roads, no freeways, just all the way through Oakland, all the way through the suburbs before we got to the open country. And there we found, and the laboratory was, it's about a couple miles, I think, from the little town area that we found it. Most of the people had gone home because it was late afternoon on Friday, but there was somebody, the head of the chemistry or the computation department had left already, but his associate came to interview me, and actually was very positive about it. And then I got a letter of acceptance to come to work there after that. So I was working as a chemist at the time, which I did not enjoy very much.
So in 1955, then you started at Livermore, and at some point you started also to work with Bernie Older, but not immediately.
No,
so maybe you can take
actually, when I started, I was with a group of 25 men who had, most of them were veterans from the World War II, and I was the only girl and much younger than all of them. And we were in what they described was going to be a training period, but we just sat there and did nothing but talk. We had no idea what a computer looked like. We weren't shown, they were not available for us to see. And maybe once a week, somebody would come over from computation to give us a lecture about what we were going to be doing, and it made absolutely no sense to us at all, not knowing what a computer was, not knowing the language they were trying to tell us, which was an assembly language. And it just seemed, then when I finally got my clearance so I could go to the lab, they offered me the job to sit at a desk calculator and do the numerical analysis by hand. I said, no way, no way. And the head of the department looked at me and said, but that's a woman's job. He couldn't imagine why I didn't want it. I says, I'd rather teach than to sit there and do that. So then they assigned me to the UNIVAC, and that was the very first computer that came to the laboratory. They already had an IBM 701 and a 704 and wanted more and more programmers. But a few of us, or actually I think I was the only one of the group of 26 in the cooler who went to the UNIVAC. And I was not assigned to Bernie. I had another assignment, which was really confusing because I had never been exposed to that. Actually, when I went to see the UNIVAC the very first time, I was in awe. I just couldn't imagine anything as fast as it worked. The tapes were spinning like mad, and there were lights flashing, and it took a whole big room of computers, tapes in the computers. So it was really a exciting and fun time. And I got my first assignment. I remember who the physicist was who I was working for, but I have no idea I can't remember at all what my assignment was. I was given a set of instructions for the UNIVAC, and a piece of paper to write my code on, and said, here, write your code. And our offices at the time were exposed to everybody, so whenever anybody walked by your office, they could see you there. And one of the fellows was nice enough, when he went by, came in and said, you look so confused, can I help you? And he was able to spend time with me and go through the instructions and show that here's the equations you want to code, here's the instructions, and you start out by adding these two numbers together, and essentially gave me a quick course in programming. And it was a simple enough program that I didn't have to really spend too much time trying to figure out what I was trying to calculate. It was very matter of fact. They gave me the formulas to use, and I could just write them down. And that was, after that, I just taught myself how to program. What was interesting, that the same fellow who taught me that loved being a programmer. He really enjoyed programming, and he had fun doing it. And his influence really meant that I always enjoyed programming, and I always had fun at the same time. It wasn't a matter of work. It was a fun experience.
But you were sharing an office with Mary Grace.
Okay, then I started to work with Bernie. I was sharing an office with Mary Grace, was assigned to work for Bernie, and I usually would listen and involve when he came in to talk to her. But very often, he only came to work 2 days a week, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he'd come in shortly before lunch. So by the time he came to pick his output up and talk to Mary Grace had gone home for lunch, but I was there, and he'd ask me, can you get me the output? Can you do this? And can you do this? Well, of course, I was very willing to. I found him a very charming person to work for. And so I was doing whatever he asked me to do. And when Mary Grace left, she was pregnant and was waiting to have her baby. When she left the lab, Bernie asked the head of the department, can't Mary Ann take and work for me? And I was very glad to do that. And so it was, looking back, I can't really remember when this occurred. I think it was early in the year 1958. Actually, the slide said that he'd been to Los Alamos. I think it was in the summer of '57. And I don't remember that occasion, so it certainly was after that.
In the lab, I guess that, digital computers did emerge first in the national labs in the US because of weapons research. But how did the people in the lab view digital computing in general?
Well, because the computers were the only thing we really were aware of, I thought they were a very important part of the laboratory, and the people I knew were all using the computers, so I thought of it, the weapons department was responsible for providing the computers for their work, and it was also available to other people who had money in their budget to use the computers. Bernie, however, was working for theoretical physics and wouldn't have had a big budget to work on the computers. So he made an arrangement with the head of the department that I'm willing to use any idle time that there's available on any of the computers, and they agreed that was good because that way they could come back and say, we're using our computers very efficiently, we need some more. And they kept buying every new computer that was manufactured in those days. And so it was a very interesting time because we were getting continually new computers, and I worked on all of them with Bernie.
Can I just briefly follow up on this point? You said that it was important to use all the idle time. Is it something that Bernie would do, or would you do that?
Well, it was his idea, but I did all the work that used it. And over the years, I became very efficient at it, and to the fact that we were the largest user of computer time, which than anybody else at the laboratory. And I got more and more efficient so that almost everybody who had working on the computers thought of Bernie's work as being of no use. It was just using computer time. And I remember one supervisor telling me that he thought that I was a vacuum cleaner that was just using up time. They gave no value to it.
So apart from the work with Bernie, because you worked for a long time with Bernie Older, and you said initially you were not involved with it. Afterwards, have you been involved in other projects?
Well, I worked with Bernie as long as I could use classical physics because he did not want to have to spend any time explaining what he wanted. And so when he got to the point where you needed Monte Carlo method and quantum mechanics and went beyond classical physics, I was lost. He tried to encourage me to go on to graduate school and take those classes so I could keep working. But that working for him was just too intense. There was no way I could go to graduate school at the same time as I was working. And I wasn't particularly interested in going on. So when we reached that point, then I started working for other physicists. At first, I was really exhausted. Working for Bernie was intense. I have to admit that.
Also for his students, I understand.
What?
Also for his students, I understand.
Yeah, that's right. And so I didn't really want to take another assignment that was really hard work, so I told him I'd be available to help people who needed help with their programs. And I enjoyed that period because I got to work on old codes that needed to be redone, or the physicists or engineers or whoever was asking for the code wanted to insert new ideas into it, their code that had been written years and years ago. And to me, it was fascinating to take somebody's code and just, there were no comments. It was really old time. People had self-taught themselves how to program, so it wasn't any pattern to them. And to me, I enjoy puzzles and things like that, so I dig through these codes and find out how to add new formulas inside of them. And at the same time, efficiency was the most important thing for me. So I would go through those codes and redo parts of them, because for one of the things is the time was always, things were always in consecutive time, and if you can believe it, they'd have input that they wanted to put into the computer that was time-based, and every time, one of the codes was every time they start at 0 time and look for where does it fit in to put the new data in, and it was consecutive, so that once they'd gone that far, you only had to look beyond that. And the physicist I worked for gave it back to, just couldn't imagine that it was so fast, because it had taken them forever with the old code. And I had added a significant amount of programming to it, so that it was doing a lot more than it had done before and was very efficient.
Can I ask one thing? On this picture, there's Bernie Older, but there's also Tom Wainwright, who he is also.
Okay.
So you interacted with both, but can you tell a bit about the relative contributions?
Actually, at the beginning, I just worked with Bernie. I was on the UNIVAC for quite a few times, and he was just involved with the UNIVAC. The coding that was done with Tom had been started by somebody else. I think, at least when I took over the IBM, went to the IBM 704 and other consecutive computers, the work had started, and other people were working with Bernie on these what we call the STEP program. The UNIVAC, we called our program APE, which was Approach to Equivalence, which equilibrium approach. And I never figured out what STEP stood for, but we called our program STEP after that. And I think that the first coding I did on the STEP was with Tom. And the way Bernie worked with other people is he would start explain what he was working on with me, but then he'd tell me to go to Tom every day and find out what they wanted to work on, what they wanted to add to the code. And so I worked directly with Tom and he would give me all the input to put in and the changes to make, and I'd bring the output to him. And I never did see the part that Bernie and Tom worked together on. Yes. Once I gave the output to the physicists, I never paid any attention to what happened to it after that. And if you look at the picture of that Tom and Bernie and I are, and you see these big, big stacks of paper. In the early days, programming was so different from what it is today. Paper was everywhere. We used paper to write our codes on. We used paper on the paper cards to punch the input into the computer. And when we were debugging our code, had big stacks of memory dumps. Every time we got a bug in the code, we take a memory dump, the whole memory, and sift through it looking for what was wrong. And so paper was the biggest item we had in every phase of our work. And originally we were doing things, writing on paper and pencil, paper cards, and paper output. I enjoyed that picture of us all three together because that was what I gave to them when I was giving them output. It would stack up in their office, desk high, and they had to actually get the data from it and dig through it to find out. So Bernie had Tom had hard work to do.
But you also worked with other physicists at Livermore, like...
Over the years, I did work for Bernie. I don't remember exactly when I started, but it was at least 25 years. It could have been 27 years. And over that period of time, it wasn't just Tom. Summer people would come there and work with them. And people over the years knew physicists were hired that were working in molecular dynamics with Bernie's group, and I would work with them. For instance, Bill Hoover was one of the people who came, I think. He came the year, Bernie spent a year in Israel on a sabbatical, and when Bill first came, Bernie would send me the information and go tell Bill, this is what we want to work on, and then I'd work on that. Bill would give me all the information I needed. There were other physicists who came to work with Bernie, who it was more or less the same thing that I would. Then he had students who would work under him, and they'd want to use the step code, and I'd work with students who were there, summer employees, professors from other colleges would come and spend the summer working with Bernie, and Bernie would assign them to say, she'll do your coding for you if you work with her. And even though they worked with Bernie, I would work exclusively with the visitor.
I understand that the only student who actually ever understood your code was, not surprisingly, Charlie Bennett.
Yeah, that's right. That was very interesting because he had an interesting problem. For one, and is that he just left one of the particles out, and he wanted to see what happened. And I worked with him all summer, all the time, and he only was working on the code. It was his doctorate he was working on, so it was a continual working back and forth, and he learned my code very well. And my code had no comments in it. It was very, I had spent lots of time making it very efficient, so going through it, you didn't know what was going to happen next. I'd store things away in a very convenient place so that you didn't have to go out of memory, a fast memory, to get the next information. So it was not easy to follow. Anybody looking at it would probably kind of throw up their hands, I think. But Charles Bennett was very diligent and worked with me, and he understood it well enough that he did get back east where he was, I don't know if he went to MIT or Harvard or where, but he had it with him, and he could make changes to it, and he did his whole PhD. It was very interesting when he came back to the lab after he got his degree, and he came to talk to me to explain how he had finished it. And at the end of that, he says, "Oh, it's so nice to talk to you." He says, "Most of the time I have to spend all my time explaining what the code does before I can ever tell the results, and all he had to tell me was the results."
Right. One thing that is, of course, clear from the slides that Michel showed is that molecular dynamics has had a huge impact and continues to have a huge impact. To what extent were you aware of the impact of the kind of calculations that you were pioneering?
You mean as far as Bernie's?
Well, what the impact in general was of Bernie's work, or in general of molecular dynamics?
I don't think that I really paid any attention to what the results of my coding did. I gave them to Bernie, and he wrote the papers, and I knew that he acknowledged me at the end, but I didn't understand what he was solving, and actually, I never saw the papers, really. Just in the last 2 years, I've been on the internet, and I got a list of them, and I'd read the titles, and they'd be completely meaningless to me. The physics terms were not what I discussed with Bernie, and I'd have to get the dictionary out and find out what some of these words meant. One of the interesting things is, everybody talks about simulation. I never heard that word the whole time I was working with him.
Now, one paper where your name actually is in the list of authors is a paper with Bernie and C. Salzberg. Maybe you can tell a bit about the history of that paper.
That was very interesting. Dr. Salzberg, and I never did call it, we were, at the lab we were on first name basis with everybody, but with the visitors who were professors from the universities, I tended to call them Dr. Kalos, Dr. Salzberg. And he came out one summer and had a special problem that he wanted solved, and Bernie naturally said, work with Marianne. And Bernie never really was involved with our discussions with Dr. Salzberg. The only reason I now know what we did was that I found the paper on the internet, just looking for, I wasn't even looking for it, but my name is as one of the authors, and Bernie had told me that at the time that he would use my name there, but I didn't know the paper had ever been written. I didn't know that it had been published. But I came across it, and my husband said, you can buy it, let's buy a copy. So he bought a copy of it, and when I read the paper, I remembered the coding, and what it was, instead of using the round balls for the hard spheres, it was very close packing, and it was a dodecahedron that we worked with, so they had flat surfaces. When they had a collision, they had a flat surface, and the coding ended up being quite different from the other codes that I had. And I'd started it, and I think we had a few runs, but he had told me more or less what he wanted the whole time. He was with me, but summer was over much too soon, and he said he'd come back the next summer to work on it. So I just put the coding aside and left it as it was. And the next year he was going to come during the summer. He was in a car accident and was killed. And there we were with this code. And Bernie was interested enough with the code that he wanted it finished. And he told me if I would write if I would finish the code and do all the runs and write him a list of what I had done and how we had coded it up, he'd put me as an author of the paper that he wrote, because he wanted to publish the paper in honor of, in memory of Dr. Salzberg. And that's why I ended up being an author, which was not the usual thing for a programmer to have.
Well, there are many more things I would like to ask, but actually I would like to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions either to you or to Michelle. So I think that at this point I would like to stop the interview. I'd like to thank you very, very much for doing this. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you, Dan. Thank you, Marianne. Michel, maybe you can grab a chair and come with us here. So it's an afternoon full of surprises. We are running a little late. Nicola Marzari, who is a very generous person also, apart from being a great, great scientist, and who is aware of the importance of questions and of the importance of aperos at the end of questions, has very gently agreed to skip his short intervention so that we have a little bit more time for questions before we go to have the apero, which will be served in the mezzanine upstairs. So, who wants to start?
You should always ask who wants to ask a second question.
See, who wants to ask the second question?
No, there was a question there.
There is a question there. Go.
Thank you. John, can you hear me? Thank you very much for this inspiring conversation. I wanted to ask if you had the chance to, all this knowledge that you acquired about coding, if you had the chance to give this on to younger people, if you were also like in the education of people at the institute, maybe.
Can you repeat it to me?
If you were able to pass on all your knowledge about coding to younger people, the people at the lab. I mean, is that more or less your question? I summarize now very briefly. Yes?
I still...
Oh, you still didn't
I'm
hear.
sorry.
Whether you were able to pass on your knowledge of coding to younger people, in particular in the lab. Like whether you were able to
Could
train,
you teach anybody about your code?
Your coding technique.
Was I able to what?
Teach
coding.
Teach.
about
Coding.
your code.
Actually, I always was concentrated so much on just my work, and I was not. I don't know how to answer that really. I was not regarded that much as a good programmer at the lab to be even asked to do anything like that. Does that quite answer it? I was not. I don't know how to express it. My working for Bernie seemed to be. Not part of the general.
It was not the main
So you have to remember that Livermore was a weapon
It's
design.
a weapons.
It's a place where they used to design weapons. So the core activity there was that. And what she was doing with Bernie was sort of a semi-hidden type of thing that nobody was really
I was using the idle time, and I had taught myself how to program, so that I was not doing what after the. I'd say. Let's see, in the 1960s, the computer scientists, and we really differentiated those days between being a programmer and a computer scientist. We wanted to be called computer scientists. That was our official thing. And all of the new hires had master's degrees in computer science that they had been taught at college and university levels, and they looked down on our own on us who had written our own programs with no comments, no nothing, did not follow procedures, did not use what they had been taught at the university good programming was, and so we were not asked to help other people at all. It was, I will say at the lab, though, where I worked, every time a new computer came, we did have classes in the new computer, and there were people who did help and start people to learn each new machine. One thing I enjoyed at the lab, I think, and one of the experiences I had, which was which was really rich, was that we got a new computer about every 2, 3, 4, 5 years over the long period of time, and I had all this experience on so many different computers, always learning what this new computer could do, which previous computers couldn't do. And so just working up there was a learning experience. That's much more than you wanted.
So we have another question over there.
Yeah, I was wondering.
Louder.
Yeah, I was wondering, what is the piece of code you're the most proud of, and why?
Which one I was most proud of?
Of which piece of code?
Which color?
Being efficient.
You don't have a particular program where you say that's really
Well,
made a big difference? That insight or?
Well, I worked for Bernie on STEP for 25 years, and so I knew the code in and out, and it just got so that I made it concise, very efficient, using each computer to its maximum, and because I was getting idle time. The idle time was sharing with at the end was sharing with other people who were running at the same time. And when they had to wait for a tape to be read or I would be able to go in and use any time they weren't using. So in that sense, I felt like I was really doing a good job. Does that answer the question? I don't know.
There is another question.
Very much. So, did you, amongst the computer scientists, did you feel like you were treated any differently because you were a woman? For example, did the question ever arise of this, if you hadn't ignored this thing about men only applying, you wouldn't even have been there?
I would say that never was I treated as being a woman with the people I worked with, my co-workers. However, it was the supervisors, the people in computation who were ranking us, who were actually didn't know the intimate part of our work, who just they were very prejudiced against women. I remember one year I had did a very good job at work. I felt like I had done something extraordinary, and I got a very low raise. And I went to my group leader and asked him why, and he told me, "Be glad you got $25. I had to give a zero raise to somebody." And he says, "Of course, the women are the one who got those zero raises, got the low raises," because he said, "I could never look at a man and tell him he wasn't going to get a good raise." So, and in that sense, we were treated differently, but there were always some women who they treated very well. And so they could say, "Well, look, we're doing okay." But I have to say that my biggest raises were those raises that raised me up from when women were given a raise that, in my case, though I was ranked low, they found a man who was ranked low and raised my raise to his level, my salary to his level, and it was the biggest raise I think I got the whole time I was there. So it did make a difference if you were a woman.
Thank you.
More questions? There's one right there, Sandra.
I'm doing okay.
Hello. I wanted to ask how hard it was to keep up with the innovation, because computers were evolving so fast. So how hard it was to keep the pace?
Keep up with innovation.
Yeah,
How hard was it to keep up with the new computers, with the innovation?
I did not have any problems with that, and one of the reasons that I got as much time on machines was early on. The very first machines we worked on were assembly language and machine language coding, where we had to write. It was brand new, and you had to completely rewrite your code. But as soon as we had Fortran, which was, I don't know, a symbolic language, we could take that one from machine to machine, so that the newer machines, we were only interested in new features, and they were easier to do. Most of the problem with that, I was always the first one to go on the new machines because I was willing to recode my what we called subroutines, which I don't know if they have subroutines anymore.
Sometimes we do, yes.
And I would write my subroutines very specific to my step code, whereas they had to wait until a general subroutine was written by somebody, and I would try to be as on the machine almost as soon as it arrived, as long as it had a Fortran, could read and assemble a Fortran code. And my code I could write the same code. Most people would, when a new machine came, would actually start a whole new program to write a new program to run on that machine, and so it took them a long time to write a code. But because I was doing the same basic things from machine to machine, it was very easy for me, and I didn't have any problems with that. And very often I was the first person who would run on a new computer, and I was always the last one, because as soon as a machine got old, nobody wanted to run on it anymore. So they gave us as much time as we wanted until they pulled the plug. So it was one reason I got lots of time.
So,
Thank you.
thank you. Any more questions? If not, so I would like to close the proceedings before we go for our apéro. When we first started thinking about this, there were so many things, so many ways we could have gone, right? But I think in the end, getting to know Marianne and understanding how much she enjoyed doing what she has been doing for over 40 years at Livermore, for me, the most important message was, just be yourself and have fun. This is something that she has told us many, many times throughout the discussions that we've had in these days. From our side, our intention was, well, first of all, very selfish. We all wanted to get to know you. But then it was also perhaps a bit less selfish in the sense that we did feel that having you, the title we chose, right, which is Almost Famous, A Woman Behind the Code, as a story. And the story is that at the Livermore National Lab, the Women Association has created a gallery of characters who should have been recognized by the community but never were. And Marianne actually has a spot of honor on their wall, or maybe not, we don't really know where she is. But this is the poster, and the poster in Livermore is Almost Famous. So we feel that what we are trying to do by telling her story and by telling the story of other women that, like her, contributed, like Daan said, to many of the important steps in science and in computing, is to try to take the almost out of that equation. So I'm happy that I had the opportunity to get to know her. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I have. And we'll all be around for some more questions for about half an hour. So thank you for coming and sharing this experience with us.